إِنِّي عَبْدُ اللَّهِ آتَانِيَ الْكِتَابَ وَجَعَلَنِي نَبِيًّا. This is happening in the courtyard of Masjid al-Aqsa, where he says, as a baby, Prophet Isa is saying, I am the servant of Allah. He has given me the book. He has made me prophet. So there is no shortage of religious significance there. And one thing that I will close with is there is perhaps no struggle that mimics the struggle of the Rasul والسلام, and the Seerah more than what is happening in Palestine. Our hearts break for any Muslim in any part of the world, here, in Palestine, in Sudan, due to civil war, in Burma, in China, in Kashmir, in Chechnya, in Yemen, in any of those countries, our hearts break for our fellow Muslims and people who are not Muslim out of humanity for them, out of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has compelled for us to feel in compassion for other people. Our hearts break for those people. And our hearts make dua and cry for those people. Additionally, the sanctity of Masjid al-Aqsa, the sanctity of Bayt al-Maqdis, gives it an even added and intensified love in our hearts and essential call to action in our hearts. To the extent that the Rasul ﷺ on his deathbed, one of the last things he does is he sends an army forth to liberate the land of Bayt al-Maqdis from the Romans who had completely terrorized and destroyed the area. And when he was on his deathbed, the army is led by a young man, Usama bin Zayd, who was no more than 19 years old. Okay, no more than 19 years old, he's leading the army. And when they hear that the Prophet is most likely going to die, they say maybe the army should come back. So the army comes back, and Usama bin Zayd goes and sees the Prophet ﷺ, and the Prophet is not able to speak. He's laying on his deathbed, he's not able to speak, but he looks at Sayyidina Zayd, Sayyidina Usama bin Zayd, and he just points to the heavens with one finger up, indicating, go back to your mission. It was revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that Bayt al-Maqdis was to be in the hands of Muslims. And when the Muslims under the Khilafah of Sayyidina Umar liberate Palestine, you have to understand that prior to that, the temple in the area where Masjid al-Aqsa was had been turned into a garbage dump. The Romans turned it into a place where the horses would use the bath. The Masjid al-Aqsa was turned into a place where horses used the bath. And when Sayyidina Umar liberated the city, they demanded to find 40 Jewish families that were in exile and resettle them into Bayt al-Maqdis, into Palestine. And throughout history, it has always been that Jewish tribes who have been fleeing persecution from Western Europe have found refuge in Muslim land, whether it was in the Ottoman Empire, whether it was at the time of the Spanish Inquisition, when the Spanish did not discriminate between Jews or Muslims, and they had to leave those lands of southern Spain, of Andalusia, and they settled in where? North Africa, Morocco, Algeria, Libya, Tunisia, Mauritania, and you have Jewish communities flourishing there. So anyone who wants to say this has anything to do with Islam and Jews is completely misguided on this stuff. And I want to say, in a prophetic sense, there are people who genuinely think that this is Islam versus Judaism. There are people who genuinely think that Muslims hate them. Okay? And there are people who, unfortunately, from amongst us think that all Jews hate Muslims, or all Jews are against Palestinians. What we need to do is do our best to have the conduct of the Prophet ﷺ when he has these conversations, so that even if the other person is saying complete nonsense, something that we know is false, that we can receive what they are saying and respond in kind. I'll give you an example. In the seerah, towards the end of the seerah, we'll transition into the direct current event, but this is very important. In the seerah, Utbah ibn Rabi'ah, he was one of the distinguished elders of Quraysh. He comes to the Prophet ﷺ when he wants him to stop preaching in Mecca. And he says, I'm going to give you an offer, and you should be able to accept any one of these offers. They're good offers. He says, if you want wealth, if you want them to stop preaching, it's bad PR for Quraysh, that all these people are converting to Islam, that there's tension amongst idol worshippers and people who are submitting to Allah. He says, if it's money you want, we will give you all of our wealth. If it's power you want, we will make you our king. And the Arab all wanted to be leaders. So for them to say, we'll make you our king is a huge deal. If it's women you want, we will marry you to the most beautiful women. And he said, this is not what I... And he let him finish. So Rasulullah knows this has nothing to do with his mission. He does not want any of these things. But he lets him, despite what he's saying being completely outlandish, he listens to it completely. And when he's done, he says, have you finished saying what you have to say? He says, yes. He says, now listen to me. And then he begins to recite from Surah Al-Fussilat. Okay? He recites in the most matter-of-fact, beautiful way, as Sayyidina Jibreel reveals the Prophet ﷺ to the extent that Utbah is completely shaken to his core, and he leaves a different person. And the Quraysh are saying that the Prophet ﷺ must have done some bad. Okay? And I'm saying this because people will say and will ask very difficult questions, not difficult in that they're hard to answer, but difficult in the sense that they might make you furious. They might make you furious. Or they might say things that make you furious to your core. And you'll be like, how can you justify massacring Palestinians, starving them, ethnically cleansing them? How can you justify this? And they will say things that will make your blood boil. And my message to you is do your best to stay composed and reply in a way that will reach their heart. Because what we need to do is change people's hearts. Change people's hearts. To channel the anger and the rage we have into something very productive. And perhaps there's no better example of this than the continued stories of Prophet Musa alayhi salam. When he is sent to Fir'aun, he has seen massacre his own people, the Bani Israel, time after time again. Right? Many surahs, whether it's Surah Taha, or Surah Al-Qasas, Surah Al-Safat, or many of those surahs, we'll talk about the story of Prophet Musa. So just some dawah tips in terms of talking about this subject. But let's talk about it more directly. Okay? So we've talked about the religious significance. When we're talking about what's going on in Gaza, we have to understand there are two narratives going on. And those two narratives are not even close to being the same. There are those who want to say history started on October 7th, 2023, when they want to frame it as these terrible terrorist attacks happened at the hands of Hamas, who did plenty of things, and they attacked military bases, and they took many hostages of the military as well as civilians, and civilians were killed. And then Israel has the right to defend itself, is what every head of state has been saying, from Biden to our Secretary of Defense, to Netanyahu himself, to everybody across all facets of Western government has said Israel has the right to defend itself. And in addition to that, we must completely destroy Hamas to make sure it has no heartbeat, basically. And this is really, does anybody want to reply to this, by the way, before I say something? I just want to say that that's what the Western media is largely. The Western media is largely. Okay. And on our side, we know that they have, since then, they've cut off all food, water, electricity. And they said, and we have people who were the former prime minister, such as Naftali Bennett, who says, we are responsible for feeding people who are terrorists. These people are Nazis. We're not going to feed them. We have no right to feed them. We have no need to feed them, amongst other things. right? We have the statistics pointing to 420 children being killed a day, right? We have many credible human rights organizations saying that Gaza is essentially being strangled, okay? And the Israeli military has published a paper that they're not hiding, but a couple of weeks ago, they're basically asking to remove all of Gaza's residents to the Sinai Peninsula, to move them out of Gaza into Egypt, 2.3 million of them. When I say ethnic cleansing, do you know what that means? The younger folks in 6th and 7th grade. For anybody who doesn't know what ethnic cleansing is, it means that the forced removal of a people because who they are from one place to another place. When I say genocide, I mean the systematic killing of a people because of who they are, okay? It could be Muslims, it could be Palestinians, it could be another group, it could be the Native Americans, as we saw in this country. It could be what happened to West Africans, African Americans, Black Americans, and so forth, okay? So that is one side of the media, okay? And we know that, yes, Hamas did attack military bases. We know, yes, they did take hostages that were soldiers, and they did take human hostages. But history did not start on October 7th. You see, what we need to do as Muslims and as people of truth is bring this back to the core. People want to cry about hostages being taken. The reality is Gaza itself is a hostage situation. Gaza's residents themselves are prisoners. There are 2.3 or 2.4 million people in Gaza trapped in what President Jimmy Carter, former president of the United States, described as the largest open-air prison. Okay? Gaza, prior to October 7th, 92% of the water is not potable, meaning you cannot drink 92% of the water you access from wells. Okay? The children, all of you, if you were living in Gaza, you would be shrinking. Okay? The children in Gaza are shrinking in size from generation to generation. Why? Because they don't have enough nutrition. Okay? So, there are people who want to see neutral in the media that say, yes, we know that the conditions of the people of Gaza are terrible. We know that that's terrible. But you have to absolutely condemn everything that the people in Palestine are doing, that the people in Gaza are doing. And I think that's a little bit short-sighted. I think that's a little bit short-sighted because, as I will talk about briefly, one of the things when people like to ask me, do you condemn Hamas? Do you condemn this? Do you condemn that? I like to say the following. 500 villages, at least 500 villages, were either massacred or ethnically cleansed or destroyed decades before, and over 750,000 Palestinians were either ethnically cleansed or massacred decades before any of these groups ever existed. Okay, and I'll talk about the root causes of that shortly. That's one. Two, there has never been an occupation or colonialism or apartheid, except that there has been resistance. And international law recognizes the right to resist a colonial authority or an occupier. And three, unfortunately, there has never been resistance against an occupier, except that that resistance was violent at times. We live in the United States. The United States land was stolen from who? The Native Americans. Who was more entitled to the land? The Native Americans were. Okay. You see, the Americans who came here, they were fleeing religious persecution in Europe, right? They were sick and tired of the Roman Catholic Church. So they came here, the Puritans, they called themselves, right? The Protestants. But they found people who they considered to be savages and barbaric, so they ethnically cleansed them and massacred them. Now, those Native Americans, they were subjected to certain elements of colonialism where they had to depend on the colonizers, the British and the nascent American community. And it was economically crippling them. So what did the Native Americans do in many cases against the English, the British, the French, the Spanish? They revolted and they killed many. Is that the same? Should that be called terrorism, or should what happened to the Native Americans be called terrorism? You come here and you take the Native Americans' land, destroy it, ethnically cleanse them off of it, and the Native Americans every once in a while muster a force to fight back. Who is the terrorist? I'm asking you. The people that came and took the land, those are the terrorists. Okay? You have to keep that in, right? You have to look at something like South Africa. South Africa was an apartheid country. Apartheid means that you have a separate set of rules for people based off of who they are. Segregation, like we saw, pre-civil rights movement. The black South Africans used different restrooms, had different stools, had different set of rules and codes when it came to the police than white South Africans. Who was the leader of the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa? Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela spent 29 years of his life in jail. He's one of the most incredible people to have lived in these contemporary postmodern times. Nelson Mandela was labeled a terrorist for 29 years. Okay? Everybody thinks that's the craziest thing in the world. But at the time, they considered him a terrorist. And now we have people considering the Palestinians as terrorists when they're the ones being kicked off of their land. So it's important for us to note how this happened, all right? And we have to be very honest with how we got it. So when we're talking about this, it's important to note that the Jews will say that we have a claim to the land of Palestine. And that is true, because did they not live there for many years? Absolutely. But were they the only people to live there? No, they weren't. And even when the kingdom was ruled by the Jewish prophets, who are the Muslim prophets as well, we consider them to be Muslim, they were never the only people there. And because of their relationship with God, they knew they are not allowed to commit murder and atrocities and force people out of the land unless there was just cause. We contrast that to present day Israel, which is completely against what the Mosaic law, the law that was revealed to Prophet Musa alayhi salam, said, and so forth. And it's very, very different. So you have somebody like Bezalel Smotrich, who's in the parliament, and he echoes what Netanyahu, their prime minister, says when speaking to some of the Arab members of the parliament. He says, "You're only here by mistake. You're only here because David Ben-Gurion did not finish the job, that he did not get rid of you when we first formed the state." Okay. Now, David Ben-Gurion, he is their first prime minister. He's the person that the airport is named after. Okay. When the state was being formed, he was saying, we must expel the Arabs and make sure they never come back. We must take their places by hook or by crook. Basically, we must do it in violent means if we have to. And he says, if I was an Arab, I would never sign a treaty with the Jews, because we are the ones taking their land. In his diary, he writes all of this. He writes all of this. Chaim Weizmann, who is one of their founding fathers as well, he's the second prime minister. He calls and he refers to the Palestinians as the rocks of Judea. Judea is one of the classical names in the Israeli historiography of historic Palestine. And he refers to us as the rocks of Judea. Okay? I say this, and when I present at a university, I tell people, I'm not quoting to you what your drunk uncle at Thanksgiving, who is racist, and you only have to see him once a year, is going to say. I'm quoting to you what George Washington of present day Israel is saying. I'm quoting to you what the founding fathers of that country are saying. I'm quoting to you what the people who are on your dollar bills are saying, the people who your airports are named after are saying. And that has not changed from then until now. Very clearly, they view the Palestinians and whether they're Arab Muslims, Arab Christians, and frankly Arab Jews as something in the way that needs to be removed. Now let's look at how, again, we got. So the Muslims, after the Rasul والسلام, they liberated Palestine from the tyranny of the Roman Empire and stayed largely in Muslim hands until post-World War I, with a 90-year period during which the Crusades occurred. And that 90-year period is very similar to the years we are in now. After those 90 years, Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi, may Allah be well pleased with him, liberates Palestine once again. But during those 90 years, a lot of interesting things happened, including the surrounding Muslim countries around Bayt al-Maqdis making treaties with the Crusaders and fighting against Muslims who wanted to liberate Palestine. Very similar to what is happening now with the surrounding countries to Palestine, normalizing relationships with whether it's the US or Israel themselves against the interests of the Muslims and the Palestinians in Bilad al-Sham. So the British captured Jerusalem from the Turkish Ottoman Empire in 1917. And then shortly thereafter, they promised the land to the Jews. They promised the land to the Jews in the infamous Balfour Declaration. And in the infamous Balfour Declaration, Arthur Balfour, just get exact quotes because this stuff's pretty important. He promises the land of Palestine as a national home to the Jewish people. He says, and we will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object. And he says in the letter, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil or religious rights of the non-Jewish communities in Palestine. So in paper, he's saying, we're going to make a home for the Jews and we're going to make sure that it's going to be a safe place for everybody. And in another letter, he writes, and Zionism, be it right or wrong, good or bad, is rooted in age-long traditions, in present needs, in future hopes, and are far profounder in import than the desires and prejudices of the 700,000 Arabs who now inhabit that region. So what he's saying here is, we know there's a lot of people who live there, and we don't care. And we're going to establish a state for the Jews there against the wishes of the people who already live there, one way or another. Okay? So that's very important to know. And some people like to say, here's the thing, when we are talking about this, we have to make a very clear distinction between Zionism and Judaism. Zionism as a movement, it's a political, secular Jewish movement. It's not actually founded by particularly religious Jews. It's founded mostly by secular Jews who are living in Western Europe, who wanted to establish a home for Jewish people. And in principle, there's nothing wrong with that, especially given what Western Europe was like. Okay, and we have no reason to hide or deny any of these. So the Jews in Western Europe were blamed for the bubonic plague. People said that the Jews poisoned the water wells. They didn't poison the water wells. They poisoned the water wells in Haifa, in Palestine, to try and kill Palestinians, but they didn't do it in Europe. Okay, they were excluded from jobs in many countries. They were subjected to the Spanish Inquisition, just as the Muslims were. They were subjected to many massacres, in other words, pogroms in Russia, as well as other countries. And of course, it culminated with the Holocaust at the hands of Nazi Germany. We're not doing ourselves any favors by denying any of this stuff. All this stuff happened, all of it was terrible, and as a Muslim, we should stand against these things. And we did. In many cases, Jews found safe refuge in Muslim land and were suffering from these kinds of things. So somebody by the name of Theodore Herzl, who's the founding father of political Zionism, he wants to find a Jewish home so that Jews can stop suffering from this. Them suffering from these things is a terrible tragedy. But does it justify taking somebody else's land? Does it give you the right to take somebody else's land and kick them off their land and massacre them because you have suffered? Now you can take somebody else's land and make them suffer? Absolutely. So we look at Theodore Herzl, the founding father of political Zionism, his words. He writes to Cecil Rhodes. Cecil Rhodes was an Englishman who was the minister of British colonies in South Africa. Okay? The minister of British colonies in South Africa. I don't know if that sounds bad to you, but that's very big. Because South Africa was an apartheid state. Britain was the colonizing power. Britain was responsible for famines in India, for bleeding all of its colonies dry, and then making them feel like it's their fault that they're dying. And South Africa was no different. So he writes to Cecil Rhodes, and he says, I turn to you, since this is an out-of-the-way matter, and I'm asking you for help, because what I'm looking for is something colonial. I'm looking for a colonial project for the Jews. He wants to colonize Palestine, establish colonies there, and much like the US was established on colonies here, ethnic cleansing and genocide for the Native Americans, he wants to do the same thing in Palestine. Understood? Now, when the Balfour Declaration was signed in 1917, everyone in the British Parliament signed and agreed we must make a British home for the Jews. By the way, people in Western Europe were pretty happy about this because they actually hated Jews in their hearts, and by giving them a home, it allowed them to do what? Get them out of Europe. Okay, you have to understand this as well. So signing the Balfour Declaration and wanting to establish a home for the Jews was in Europe's interest because it allowed them to get rid of them from their population. They didn't do the Holocaust like the Nazis, but they hated them in their own way, which is not something that we should hold in. We judge people based off of what's in their hearts. And again, we refuge and allow the Jews to prosper in their lands for many years. Our issue is with Zionism, because it is predicated on making a exclusively Jewish home, an exclusively Jewish home. Okay, so everyone in the British Parliament signs off and says yes to a home for the Jewish people in historic Palestine, except one person. That one person, his name was Edmund Montagu. Edmund Montagu was a Jew, and he said no. Why did he say that? He says this would cause great alarm in the Muslim world and create enemies for us Jews when we have no enemies. He knows that Muslims historically have been very kind to Jews in comparison to Western Europe, Western Christianity. And he says, if you do this, you're going to cause great alarm in the Muslim world. We have communities in Iraq. We have communities in Egypt. We have communities in Morocco. And you're going to turn all of them against us Jews if you do this, because he knows there are over 1 million people, just about 1 million people living in Palestine. And where are they going to go? One of the myths is that the Jews were a people without a land, and that Palestine, if they were giving it to them, was a land without a people. Say, a land without a people or a people without a land, meaning this land was just waiting to be occupied and inhabited by people. And so we gifted it to them and nothing terrible happened. Right? And that it was a desert and they made the desert blue. We see the early Zionists, when they went and saw the land, they actually described it in their journals as the bride is beautiful, but she's married to him. meaning the land of Palestine is very beautiful, but she's already married. Meaning there's already a lot of people who live there. Meaning that if you want this beautiful land, you have to get rid of the people that are already there. This is what they directly are saying, but what they project to the Western world is a completely different message. And it's interesting because Edwin Montague, when he says this would create enemies for us when we don't have enemies, this is very much what ended up happening. Not to mention, of course, what we have to ask, and when people want to ask us, you condemn this and you condemn that, we have to be very ready to ask very big questions for the other people. Because we have the difficult questions. They have the difficult answers. Okay? They don't have the difficult questions. We have to be able to ask what gives Britain the right to promise the land to an immigrant Jewish European population when it was already inhabited by Palestinians. You know, at the time of the Balfour Declaration, 1917, Jews owned less than 2% of the land. They constituted less than 5% of the population. And between then and 1948, they let immigration, they let many European Jewish immigrants go to the land. And there's no problem with letting people come there. There's no problem with letting people come there if they're going to be treated on an equal basis, but it was clear they were not treated on an equal basis. It was clear that this was supposed to be to allow Jews to take over. So much so that European Jews treated Arab Jews like garbage. You see, my wife comes from a village called Beit Jiz. Beit Jiz was a village that was ethnically cleansed and destroyed in 1940. Okay? When her great-grandfather was leaving the village, they left the village for their lives, to protect themselves, because they heard about the massacres that had happened in villages such as Deir Yassin and Tantura, as well as other villages, right? And so they left. And on their way out of the village, an Arab Jewish man, her great-grandfather's neighbor, comes to him and begs him to not leave. Because he's hoping that what is happening in Palestine is just a terrible episode that will come. This was an indigenous Jewish man who loved his Palestinian person. And there was no issue between them. This is a man who spoke Arabic as well. My grandmother, may Allah bless her and extend her life, she's always in a state of Islam. She remembers playing with Jews in the street, kids playing with one another, babysitting each other's kids. And she also remembers Zionist militias, the predecessors to the IDF, shooting up their neighborhoods at night. And when they would shoot up the neighborhoods at night, and shoot up the houses, they were doing it to intimidate the Palestinians and to cause them to flee. And she remembers that she had Christian Palestinian friends in Beit Lahem, very close to where she lived in Quds. And depending on where it was safer, that's where they would stay. So there were some times where they would stay at their Christian friends' houses in Beit Lahem. There were times when their friends from Beit Lahem would stay with them in the Quds, very close to Masjid al-Aqsa. This is what real interfaith looks like. Not holding up the structures of oppression for one another. We have until 2:30. So I'll try and go until about maybe 2:05, and then I'll open it for questions and whatnot. You see, so they promised the land to the Jews, and they had no right to promise the land to them. Now, the United States, despite it present day offering over $3 billion of support to Israel to continue its oppression of the Palestinians, it did not always have this opinion. In 1919, there was something called the King-Crane Commission, where President Woodrow Wilson sent an independent commission to see, is it even possible to establish a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine? Is it even possible to do that? And he admits that when we went on this mission to Bilad al-Sham, we went there with a pro-Zionist bias. We went there wanting to help the Jewish people achieve their goals of having a home. Okay? And then when they went there, they realized that it's impossible to do this because other people already live there. And all of these people are starting to see how terrible the Zionist project is going to be on their lives, whether that's Jewish Arab, whether that's Christian Arabs, whether that's Muslim Arabs. They are all seeing that the European Jews that are coming here are trying to create a home just for them and to exclude the other people in society. Okay? And towards the end of the King Crane Commission letter, and you can look this up and read it, it says the officers generally thought that a force of at least 50,000 soldiers would be required to initiate a home for the Jewish people, right? And at the end, they say, if we want to give the European Jews, the Zionists, this land based on them saying, we used to live here 2,000 years ago, then that can hardly be taken serious. Okay? So they will say, this is our historic land. Well, how do you feel if someone comes up to your house in Latham or in Clifton Park or in Schenectady and says, hey, this paper here says I used to live here 2,000 years ago. So it's time for you to go and I'm going to start living here now. Does it make any sense there? It's absolutely ridiculous. Okay? And that's the simple answer to one of their many myths. Okay? So what actually happened? So prior to 1919, prior to 1917, the Balfour Declaration, again, the Jews owned less than 2% of the land, and they were less than 4% of the population. Then they let mass immigration of European Jews into Palestine to the point that right before 1948, they had 30% of the population, but still only about 6 or 7% of the land. They were trying to buy it, or the Muslims there in many cases were suffocated economically and forced to sell the land, amongst other things. And the UN comes up with a very infamous partition plan in 1947, and it says, and it wants to give 55% of the land to 30% of the Jewish population. Jewish population is now 30% of the people because they are letting them immigrate unrestrictedly. And they want to give them 55% of the land. They're giving them the majority of the land. By the way, Palestine in its entirety is smaller than Jerusalem. I think it's about half the size of Jerusalem. And one of the things that the Zionists say is you have all these surrounding Arab countries. Why can't the Arab of Palestine just go there? And what should our answer be? Why should we? I would go with that. We live there. Go ahead. What do you have to say? Masjid al-Aqsa's there, and that's a very good point. The main thing is, it's the same thing as saying, America, let's say somebody wanted to come and take New York State from us, right? Somebody wanted to take New York State from us. It said, look at how big America is. And America is 1,000,000 times bigger than Palestine. and you can make the argument that it makes even more sense here, but obviously it's preposterous. It's like, you 12 or 15, or what's the population mean? I know New York City is like what, 8 million? But anyway, let's say there's 15 million people in New York. It says 15 million people in New York. Why don't you just go to the rest of America? There's nobody living in Montana, in Wyoming, in North Dakota, or South Dakota. Why can't you just go to all those places? There's plenty of, and there really is plenty of land. What would you say to them? One, why don't you go? Or how am I going to pick myself up and leave? You want me to leave my home? You see, the reality is, I was talking to my 8th grade history teacher a few weeks ago. I ran into him in my hometown in Lyndhurst, New Jersey. And he was saying, I don't really like what's happening. You must be really worried. I said, yeah. So none of what Mass has done is going to make any of this better. I said, you know what? Listen. If somebody comes to take my parents home, I'm going to call the police. And the police is going to kick them out. Okay? What's happening in Palestine is somebody's coming to kick them out of the home. They call the police, and the police is saying, actually, we're letting them. So we're not actually going to help you. And so they appeal to the international community. And the international community says the settlements and them taking your homes is against international law. But oh, wait, at the same time, here's $4 billion a year to keep doing it. So we're concerned that they're taking your homes, but here's $4 billion a year to take your homes. So are they really concerned? No, they're not. Okay? And so they want to act like this violence is coming out of nowhere. The reality is they've tried peaceful means in many ways. In 2017-18, there was the Great March of Return in Gaza, where they marched for a year nonstop, peacefully, demanding the right to return to the land that was stolen from them. And Israel still killed hundreds of people who were just marching for peace. No violence whatsoever. Okay? And so again, people want to act like, people want to say, do you condemn the violent actions of this group and that group? And you just have to say, look, these people, their villages were destroyed. They were kicked off of their land long before any of this happened. And you continue to subject them to the most humiliating forms of life. And you were surprised that they respond in violence sometimes, when the reality is most of the time they respond peacefully. Let me tell you what it's like in the West Bank, for example. West Bank is the area where my father's side is from. My father is from a small village next to Naples. By the way, right now the economy is completely stalled there. Nobody's really working. If anybody has like a corner store, the Israeli Defense Force could come at any time and say, time to go home, close up shop. You can't do anything. If you don't leave, they can shoot you, they can detain you, they can do whatever they want. Nobody's going to stop it. Okay? What it's like in the West Bank. You have very little mobility. You can go from here to Latham, and you have to take 3 different taxis because there's huge boulders in the road that stop you. And you have to get into 3 different taxis. You have good salary, and you have to pay 3 different taxi fees. So it suffocates you. You have to rely on Israel for most of your goods. And if they want to send you bad goods, which happened to my family directly, they were like chicken farmers, and they sent us like sick chicken that would not grow, would have no meat on their bones. And you would still have to pay them for the chicken, and nobody would buy the chicken from them for meat because they were diseased. So then my family's chicken business basically has to close as a result of this purposeful nonsense that they did to cripple the different Palestinian businessmen and so forth. That's some of the things that go on. So our family did not lose their village, but they lost about 600 acres of it. So, for example, in our village, it's very close to the settlement of Ara'il, which is an illegal settlement that is taken from stolen land from some of our neighboring villages. And there's a highway system which connects it to what they call present-day Israel. It's a highway, just like Interstate 87 right here. It'll take you to another city or another state very quickly. Palestinians can't use that interstate. On the other side of that interstate is the rest of our village's farmland. I can walk across it because I'm an American. My grandfather, if he wants to walk across it, would get shot at, for example. Or they could detain him, or they have the right to shoot. They might not, but they could, right? And so this is the way they take half of your farmland. They cripple you, right? And when the UN gave Israel, or the Jews, 55% of the land, it wasn't any 55% of the land. It was the most fertile land. It was the land that had the best water. It was the land that had the best crops, the best trees. They literally did research on how many trees were in a village, which trees were the best trees, right? It gave them the best access to the waterways, the ports, so they could have a good flourishing navy, so they could get good shipments from the Mediterranean, and so forth. So it was very systematically, it was done in a systematic way to advantage the Jews over the Palestinians. And then on the eve of their independence, immediately, they go and seize 22% of the land that was promised to the Palestinians. One, the British had no right to give it to the Jews to begin with. That's the first thing we need to say. Two, the UN had no right to give the majority of the land to the minority of the population because they said they lived there 2,000 years ago. Three, the Jews had no right to take 22% of the land on the first day of their existence. Okay? And this is just some of the stuff. Now, the Jews will say, I'm going to say the Jews, the Zionists will say, well, the surrounding countries were threatening us with war when we were going to become an independent nation. And so we had to evacuate and clear the land that the Palestinians were living in. It's unfortunate. We didn't want them to leave, but they left because of war. And we had to secure ourselves by taking some of their land. This is what they like to say. And we have to say, we have to be prepared how to respond to this. The reality is, quoting to you from this is a book called The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. Highly recommended. It's written by Ilan Pappé. Ilan Pappé is an Israeli-born historian. He spent his life looking at the military archives of the predecessors to the Israeli Defense Force. He translates all of their archives, where he finds out that they had a very thorough plan where they've documented every single Palestinian village they wanted. How many people lived in the village? Which villages they wanted to massacre? Which villages they wanted to destroy completely? Which villages they wanted to keep because the houses were nice, so the crops were beautiful, it had good water sources and so forth. And he points out very clearly that they did this systematically. And you know how they did this systematically? Any of you guys ever lived like overseas at any point? You know how Arab Muslims are very hospitable, where somebody is walking in the streets and you say, oh, hello, and they say, oh, Fadal, here, come over to my house. You can come to my house whenever you want, type of thing. And sometimes people will take up that invite, sometimes they won't. So the Zionists would take advantage of that. So they would walk through the village and ask questions, and they say, oh, let's see. So they would ask any question they want, and who the mayor was, they would meet the mayor. If they didn't meet him that day, they would come back the next day, get all the information, and figure out everything in the farm. Show me your farm. Can you see your crops? Can you tell me about your family? Can you tell me what the political movements are like? And the Arab and the Palestinian and the Palestiniya, as hospitable as they are, would answer these questions. And they did it on purpose so that they could destroy them, right? And this is one of the things. By the way, I think it's racist that you would only take from what an Israeli historian or what a Western historian would say. But because people are racist, the fact that an Israeli historian is humiliating them with this information, we should be able to use it. And then we can pivot accordingly. So he points out very clearly, because he says one of the myths is that the clearing of these villages was an unfortunate consequence to war with the surrounding Arab countries. He points out very clearly that myth can be disproven by the fact that 200 of the villages that they ultimately destroyed were destroyed before 1948, were destroyed before they were an independent country. They had begun ethnic cleansing operations before they were even a country. And I will read to you some excerpts right now. Let's see. So these were their plans. Their plans included killing the Palestinian political leadership, killing any Palestinian who ever wanted to retaliate, killing any Palestinian who ever acted against a Jew, killing any Palestinian officer or official, damaging Palestinian transportation, damaging sources of Palestinian livelihood, including water wells, mills, attacking nearby villages, attacking their houses of worship, their meeting places, their coffee houses, their clubs, and so forth. So let's see. One of their tactics they did, so for example, in Haifa, the Zionist Jews were placed on land higher than this, right? So what they did in some cases, they would roll really big steel balls down the street to destroy things, and they would douse the street in kerosene and light the kerosene on fire. Then when the Muslims would come out to try to put out the fire, they machine gunned them down. Okay. Another thing they did, they would go to a Palestinian mechanic to get their car fixed. They would dress up like Muslims. They would dress up like Arab so that they would think that they're there to get their cars fixed. Their car would be full of explosives and they would blow up the mechanic. Okay. So, for example, I don't believe the media. I never believed the media when they said that Hamas beheaded 40 babies. But they did this for a particular reason, to make people think that we are these barbaric people that we can destroy all of them, right? And we have to destroy all of them so that this never happens again. I don't know what the truth is. And the people who are Palestinian really did terrible things, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will deal with it. But what I do know is that the Zionists have perpetually lied and taken land and disguised themselves as Muslims and other people to suit their own gains. An example, when they were establishing their state, they wanted to recruit as many Jews as possible. They had one problem. One of the problems was they could not recruit enough Arab Jews from Iraq, from Morocco, from Egypt. Why? When, for example, the Jews from Iraq came to see Jerusalem, they said, Jerusalem's nice, but we consider Iraq to be a piece of heaven. It's so much more sophisticated, so much more advanced, it's beautiful. Which, by the way, when you hear that, you should realize just how terrible it is that the US completely destroyed the country of Iraq. Okay, we need to understand that. A cradle of civilization, and that the libraries in Baghdad were more sophisticated than libraries at Harvard. You need to know this, okay? So, the Jews in Iraq didn't want to come to Palestine. So what did the Zionists do? The Zionists disguised themselves as Arab and Muslim, planted bombs in areas that Jewish Arabs in Iraq lived, and killed their own people to convince them that these Arabs don't like you anymore, when it was really them doing it. To convince them, because one of the myths is there's no safe place on earth for Jews except Israel. That's something they want people to believe, because it substantiates their claim that we need a home just for us. So they killed their own people so that they would want to come to Israel, this place that we told you. We told you there was no safe place. Look what happened. In reality, they're the ones who killed them. They're the ones who killed their own people, right? So this is very, very important to know. So maybe some of the things that happened with, maybe some of the things that Hamas did were bad, like beyond attacking the soldiers, which is a legitimate resistance attempt. But I'm not sure, and I'm not convinced that the Zionists did not disguise themselves to do this. They want to point to burned human beings, destroyed houses and whatnot. You need to know very clearly that Hamas and Palestine does not have the artillery to do any of that. And CNN and Fox and these newspaper companies and these news companies will never publish this. But when you go to off-site news companies, including Israeli civil rights groups and Israeli newspaper companies, they point out that hundreds of them people who were killed in the areas that were the settlements close to Gaza were killed by the IDF themselves, using tanks, using Apache helicopters. Hundreds of them were killed by their own people, okay? They will never say this in the Western media, but Jews themselves who are against what Israel are doing will say. Okay, so let's talk. Let me cover just a couple more things and then just open the floor. So again, people want to point out that as though history started on October 7th, and that's not the case, right? History started way before, when the movement started to want to create a Jewish home, an exclusively Jewish home for Jews, okay? And we want to point out that the Palestinians were living there and they were forcibly removed off of their land. We need to read and know things that we can point out that they were ethnically cleansed and massacred off their land. They were treated like garbage. They did not have access to food. They did not have access to water. They did not have access to many of the things that you take for granted. They tried to protest peacefully. They tried to appeal to the international community. Nobody listened to them. Nobody really gave them their due rights. This is an apartheid state that treats one group of people fundamentally different than others, and it's recognized by everybody in the world except the United States. And they are allowed to continue doing this, and they try to protest peacefully and appeal to the international community, and nobody does anything. And this results in violence. You see, Israel really I truly believe Israel wanted the people of Gaza to do this, because it gives them a reason to say, I told you so. I told you so. We had to destroy it. We had to get rid of it. I mean, when you get to the professional workplace, alhamdulillah, we fast the month of Ramadan, so we have a little bit of solace. When you're fasting, towards the end of the day, if you're not used to it or if it's difficult for you, it is difficult for some people who are very strong Muslims, you start getting angry. You don't want anybody to talk to you. That's why there's a hadith of Inni Salah. Like, I'm fasting. Remind myself, I'm not going to lose my anger because I'm fasting. I work at a company, and sometimes when people don't have lunch, they are shayateen, they're devils, because they can't control themselves without food. You starve the people. They cannot feed their children before October 7th, let alone after, where you've actually cut off everything. You were feeding them before October 7th with an eye drop. Now after October 7th, that eye drop is not even there. You don't have anything. And this is what it is. It is genocide. You are systematically killing them. You are not targeting kids. You're not targeting certain people when 40% of the people kill their children. You're not targeting them when you destroy hospitals and houses of worship and refugee camps and schools and UN buildings and press buildings. You're not targeting anybody by doing it, except the entire population. There are videos of people trying to leave. They say, we're giving you 24 hours for 1.1 million people of Gaza to go to the south. That's like saying, I'm going to shoot you. You have 3 seconds to move. If you understand how Gaza is. Gaza's transportation is already destroyed. You can't move. You're given 24 hours to move, and there's no fuel, right? There's no fuel. Gaza is about the size of Detroit and has 4 times more people than Detroit. And now you don't have its population to go to one part closer to the south. You're not letting any aid in from Rafah. These people are going to starve. You're going to kill them. And when they die, you're not going to be able to bury them because you're bombing. And because you're not going to be able to bury them, disease is going to spread and people are going to die from access to the disease of the dead bodies. So my last thing that I want to say before I can take any of your questions is the following. We are not here as Muslims in the United States for no reason. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala brought 10 times more slaves from West Africa to Brazil than he did to the United States. And yet, there are almost no Muslims from those West Africans still in Brazil, and one of the oldest Muslim communities in the United States, or perhaps the oldest, are the Black American Muslim community. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not bring us, mostly immigrants, 1 generation removed or 2 generations removed, to the United States to be middle-class citizens who have a nice house and a comfortable living, and we don't worry about the problems. Allah brought us here for an essential reason. And Allah knows best, but I know part of that reason, in my heart, I believe, is to help those who are oppressed. Okay? We are in those years similar to the years of the Crusades when it was taken from us, Palestine was taken from us. And we have to ask ourselves, are we going to be part of the people who learn this history very well and can communicate and convince people of the truth and move people to do the right thing? Okay? You are here as Muslims together, but you're going to interact with the real world. You will work with people who are not Muslim. It's not sufficient for them to just know you're Muslim. Our moral stances should be clear. We should speak very clearly on issues such as the issue of Palestine. As an example, I make mistakes, but I sent, for example, an email to multiple people in my company, including my group. I said, look, what's happening in Palestine is something that hits me very close to home as both a Muslim and a Palestinian. I just want to say that if anybody wants to have a conversation with me on this, I'm available for that. Even if you want to ask me questions that you think will make me uncomfortable, you can ask me those questions. I just ask that you'll be sincere when you ask those questions. And if the conversation gets difficult for either of us, we can stop the conversation at any point and revisit it whenever it works for us. And I'm not shying away from this. Yes. So what I need you guys to do is to be very good students. I need you to have a thirst for knowledge. I need you to look up your history and learn your history. I need you to learn to write very well, to speak very well, and to have the courage to speak, to learn, to use those reading and writing skills to speak the truth. Okay? Because when you learn well and you have that knowledge, you will be asked what you do with that knowledge. And the people of Palestine, they have been crying and making dua, and really speaking to Allah is the most important thing. It's really the most important thing. But we have a role here, in our role, in addition to making dua, in addition to donating to charities that will help the people who are oppressed in the world, is to speak words that will liberate those people. Is to turn more hearts towards what the Palestinians are going. You guys understand? That's all I wanted to say. The floor is open to any questions that you have. Yeah.
I really like our class, how to respond to because I feel like when we found out we were having a guest speaker, we thought he would mostly just be talking about like what's going on in Gaza, what's going on in Palestine. But the fact that you not only talk about that and educated ones who don't understand what's going on, the fact that you educated us on how to respond to someone who would to ask us a question that would make us uncomfortable or get a little angry, or as a Palestinian, I feel like if I was to get a question like that, my anger would rush over me, just like how, you know, Hamas has been forced to like act or how they think Hamas is acting, because when you reach a person to that point, like you react bad. So for you to educate us and tell us the proper way to respond to that, I feel like that's better for us. Now we're put as smarter and the bigger person, and now that gives us a better position. And then my question, so I was gonna say that when you were saying how the Nazis, no, not Nazis, Jews, what were they?
Zionists?
Zionists. So I was gonna say, would you picture them as doing the same thing that Hitler did to them, the way they did to us, and then they're also kind of like if this makes sense, the man who cried wolf, because like they're very how you say manipulative, like everything they say really gets to everybody, but it's been done repeatedly and lies have been done repeatedly, so they keep crying, but the media and everyone keeps feeding into it, so it's like guilt tripping in a way. Like, do you feel like it would be considered the same kind of thing that Hitler did to them, or reverse the
So there are definitely elements. There are definitely elements that parallel between the Nazis and the Zionists. They're obviously not putting Palestinians in gas chambers, killing them in one shot. So in that sense, it's not that, but it's a different type of suffering. They're not hurting the Palestinians in the same way that the Jews were exterminated by the Nazis. And I think part of that is strategy. You see, Ben Gurion, when he was establishing this, trying to establish the state of Israel, he knew that he needed to do it by force, and he knew that he needed to wait for the most opportune time, the most advantageous time to do it, so that the rest of the world would turn a blind eye. So he was looking for the perfect. And in their books, they say, we are hoping that because the Holocaust happened to us, that the rest of the world will not hold us accountable for kicking Palestinians off of their land. And they were right. And so what they've done is they've strangled the Palestinians in general before October 7th. Like I said, 90% of the water in Gaza you can't. The economic situation is terrible. 60% of the people don't have jobs. The kids are shrinking. And they've tried to protest. They tried to protest. Nobody listens to them. Eventually, somebody responds in violence. And this is the worst one. And by the way, I think they purposefully delayed their army entering those areas so that more people can be killed and they can say, look how terrible this is. And they also killed some of their own people to make the numbers worse. So that they can say, similarly to just because the Holocaust happened, now we can take all their lands. They'll say just because October 7th happened, we can now cut off their food, water, electricity. We can commit genocide. And the language that they're saying is we're dealing with human animals. We're dealing with human animals, which is a very Nazi thing to say. Because Hitler referred to the Jews as rats. What do you do with rats? You kill rats. You exterminate them. So when he calls the Palestinians as animals, he's creating this image. And when you say that they beheaded babies or raped women, neither of these things happen. You are creating this image and this sympathy to the entire world, even if you retract the articles, which they have retracted them, but it's on the front page of CNN, and then it gets retracted and you don't hear anything from the hosts. You don't hear anything from the people that posted it. It just gets retracted, right? And then you have Biden saying, I have no reason to believe that the numbers the Palestinians are saying are the numbers of people who are killed are actually true, when historically they've always twisted the numbers. If you just look at the level of devastation, you'll know that that's probably just the tip of the iceberg. They just haven't found everything, right? So there are parallels to the Nazis, and at the same time, it's different. So they're not putting them together. But this is a strategic move because it's a slow suffocation that is basically choking you to the point that you can breathe enough to still live, but it's such an uncomfortable life that will cause you to intermittently, every once in a while, explode, which the Palestinians do, even though they're peaceful most of the time. So it gives the false image to the rest of the world that they're living, and every once in a while they choose to attack us. We pulled all the settlements out of Gaza. Dude, this is a 30-foot wall. We're letting nothing into Gaza. These people have no livelihood. And then they respond with violence every once in a while as a result of that. And they use that to kill more people, to take more. So I think in a way you can argue that it is a different type of politics. It is a genocide. That's very true. And it is strategically done in a way that will suffocate the Palestinians and continue to garner Western sympathy. You want to add to that? Go ahead.
Not until recently, so have any social media or, for example, news, CNN, has anyone said anything about it? Because they have labeled it. Because I do know Muslims are labeled as terrorists. So the moment we see terrorists, they say that's terrorism or terrorists. That's the first thing to notice. So putting it on CNN, that's what finally led to Palestine being noticed is terrorists. As we heard that Hamas came out and killed 40, beheaded 40 babies. Because that's what they labeled themselves. That's what they see us, because that's what they guilt tripped it. They like to twist it. Yeah.
So I think it's important to again connect to the Prophet in these moments, because that's what's going to get us through it. Because the Prophet was called a man, he was called crazy, he was called a lunatic, he was called a magician, he was called a wizard, somebody who practiced magic. And Allah says, we know that what they say hurts you a lot. And have patience. Have patience isn't sit there and be quiet and pretend that there are no issues in the world. Have patience means you're gonna have to listen to the terrible things they say. And find it in you to dig the iman out of you and respond speaking words of truth. Whether or not they listen or not is another thing. People are misguided because of two buckets they fall into. Some are misguided because their hearts are sealed, and that's just who they are. Some are misguided because they just watch too much CNN, but there's actually goodness in there. So we don't know who is in which group. So we have to find a way to listen to the harmful things they say, speak words of truth, and hope that it opens heart. Other questions? Yes, right. So Hamas, I believe started in maybe the 80s. The exact year, but again, every single time a group has been occupied, every time somebody's taken somebody's land from them and kicked them out, there's always been a group that came to try and take that land back. Okay? And so it's important to know that if it wasn't Hamas, it would be another group. Why? Because the Zionists are taking the land from the Palestinians. There will always be resistance. The South Africans who were resisting apartheid resisted with violence. Martin Luther King, who they like to say, Martin Luther King Jr., who they like to say is a peaceful activist, towards the end of his life, he wrote an article, a paper called Why America Might Go to Hell. Why America Might Go to Jail. And he started saying that I don't really see the purpose of being peaceful. He was on a hit list towards the end of his life, and as you know, he was assassinated because he's realizing that these nonviolent approaches aren't actually doing anything to help his people. So he was becoming more like Malcolm X in terms of seeing that there has to be more radical movements in terms of resisting violence since the peaceful methods. So I don't really focus too much on Hamas or Fatah or any of the groups because they're merely resistant groups who are trying to liberate the Palestinian cause. And sometimes they're going to do things that we don't agree with as Muslims, but I never am more impressed with anything that they do wrong compared to the people who took their land, who starved them of their food and whatnot. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala teaches us in the Quran that there's a story where the Muslims had accidentally, the Muslims had killed some of the people of Quraysh outside of the Kaaba, in the holy months, the sacred months. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and it was a mistake. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the people of Quraysh, the Kuffar of Quraysh said, Prophet Muhammad, your followers have killed one of our people, and you say that you're a religion of peace and a religion of you want to practice your religion freely. By the way, these people in Quraysh, the Muslims of Quraysh lost all their land. They had to leave with just the clothes on their backs. They lost all their wealth. They had to establish themselves all over, again, zero in Medina. And they were not allowed to worship Allah the way he was supposed to, the way he deserves to be worshipped in the Kaaba. There's 360 idols, fake gods in the Kaaba. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reveals that, yes, they made a big mistake. They should not have killed them, but you kicked them out of their houses. You prevented them from worshiping Allah. You were idol worship. And all of that, and you've killed some of them too, and all of that is way worse. So if anybody in Palestine ever does something wrong in terms of violence that shouldn't have been done, that's not something we necessarily have to agree with, but I will never condemn it compared to what happened to the Palestinians. You understand? We stop there.
Started off there informative session. Before we conclude, I know some of you guys have signs that you worked on. If the last minute with honor is like standing, we can take a picture of it. So please hold up your signs. Make sure that you're not covering the sign that is behind you. And then you guys need to skip it, please. Sign and stand up against the lines.
You're not in the video as you do. This is stand up.
Guys, hold up the signs. Please, we don't take it.
Are you?
Stay in place, stay in place, just hold out the signs. Our guest people be at the front with the voice, guys. Just face this way. Okay, guys. Hold up the sign.
No, wow.
Guys, please. It is no time. Those who are behind them, just wait when it's out the ones in the front of the office. I only pray that things. It comes to size. It's all in the crowd without really. Size.
Since young. When was this one? Is that? We're pregnant, so how? Well, Romy, you guys, that's what I didn't do. Okay, well, yeah, stop.